I should have known better than to trust a neighborhood with an HOA like this. That's what Jake thought the moment he saw the group of HOA members storm onto his property, hands on their hips, eyes wide with entitlement. They were demanding access to the lake on his land, his property, which he had just bought a few weeks ago. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Jake had spent years working in construction, building things from the ground up. He wasn't about to let some overzealous HOA president push him around. Diana Graves, the HOA president, was all smiles and fake sweetness, but Jake could see right through her. She was the type who thought she could control everyone, make up rules as she went, and get away with it because of her power. Her sharp, fake smile never faltered as she tried to lay down the law. "You've got to let us manage the lake, Jake. It's for the community," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Jake stood there, staring at her, feeling the heat rise in his chest. He'd barely moved into his new home, his fresh start after a messy divorce, and now this woman wanted to take what was rightfully his. His grandfather had passed down this property to him, a piece of land with a lake that had been in their family for generations. But the HOA didn't care about that. They didn't care about his legacy or his connection to the land. They only cared about control. "You'll need to sign this document," Diana continued, holding out a piece of paper. "This gives us control of the lake and the surrounding areas." Jake's hand twitched, itching to rip the paper from her hands, but he held himself back. He wasn't the kind of guy to lash out without a plan. Diana had no idea what she was messing with. She didn't know that Jake had one thing she didn't: control over the docks. He'd done his homework before buying the property, and buried deep in the deed were the rights to every dock and water access point in the area. They weren't just his land and lake, they were his docks, too. As Diana ranted on, demanding compliance, Jake smiled to himself. He wasn't going to let her bully him. "I think you're mistaken, Diana," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't control the lake." "I do. And I control the docks." Diana's smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "You don't have the authority to make decisions for the entire neighborhood," she said, her tone growing more defensive. "Watch me," Jake replied quietly. With a simple gesture, he turned and walked toward the dock, knowing exactly what he was going to do next. It wasn't just a lake anymore, it was a battlefield, and Diana had just walked into his territory. Jake stood at the edge of his newly acquired land, feeling the cool breeze from the lake wash over him. It was his sanctuary, his fresh start after a bitter divorce. The property had been in his family for generations, handed down from his grandfather. The old man had always said that land was everything. The memories of fishing on that lake, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the scent of earth and water, that was what made it special. Jake had spent months fixing up the house, breathing new life into it. It wasn't just a property, it was a piece of who he was. But now, here was Diana Graves, standing in his backyard, acting as if she owned the place. She'd made it clear, she believed she could do whatever she wanted. Jake had been prepared for her to show up eventually, but he never expected it would be like this, so sudden, so aggressive. Diana was used to getting her way. She had spent years as the president of the HOA, pushing everyone around, enforcing ridiculous rules, and throwing her weight around. The woman believed that her version of community was the only one that mattered. Jake had always been a law-abiding guy, but he wasn't about to let her dictate his life. Not now, not here. She stood there, arms crossed, watching him as if she were waiting for him to bow down. "You know, Jake," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "this lake belongs to the community. We've been talking about how to make the best use of it." Jake could see the gleam in her eye, the same gleam she had when she thought she was in control. She didn't understand yet. "I'm not selling or leasing it to you," Jake replied, keeping his tone even. He knew exactly what she was doing. Diana had a habit of swooping in, offering something that seemed reasonable, but all she wanted was control. She wasn't asking for a piece of the land, she was asking for everything. "I don't think you understand," Diana said, stepping closer, her heels clicking on the stone path. "The HOA is going to manage this property." You can't just keep it to yourself. You're part of the community now, Jake. And we have rules. Jake felt the heat rise in his chest again, but this time, it wasn't anger. It was a calm certainty that he wasn't going to let her take what was his. I'm afraid the rules you're talking about don't apply here, he said with a smile, watching her face change from arrogance to confusion. I don't think you've read the deed, Diana. I control the docks. And the lake isn't just for the community. It's mine. Diana's face shifted slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. You're being difficult, she said, with a sigh, as if she was talking to a child. This could have been easy, Jake. We could have worked together, but if you insist on being stubborn, we'll have to take it up with the board. Jake just shook his head. Go ahead. But the board won't change anything. He turned away, heading toward the dock, feeling a surge of confidence. Diana was used to people bending to her will. What she didn't know was that Jake wasn't one of those people. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Jake didn't know what to expect next, but he knew it wouldn't be pretty. Diana was relentless, and he could see that now. The moment she realized she wasn't going to walk all over him, she stepped up her game. The next day, a letter arrived in Jake's mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo. It was official. Diana had filed a complaint, accusing him of violating community rules by blocking access to the lake. The paper was filled with legal jargon, and at first, Jake wondered how far she was willing to take this. He folded the letter, pocketed it, and walked outside, looking out at the lake. It was his, he had the right to it, but here she was, trying to take it from him. Diana had her eyes on something bigger than just the lake. She wanted to control it all. The entire community. Jake knew that much. He wasn't just fighting for the lake anymore, he was fighting for his own peace, his home. But what could he do? Diana wasn't the only one with connections. She had already made her move. But Jake had one thing she didn't: patience. He wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, Jake walked into the local county clerk's office. He spent hours combing through records, looking for a loophole, anything that could give him the edge. And then, there it was. Hidden deep within the property records, he found a clause that gave him full control over the docks. Not just the lake, but the docks where the HOA's boats docked. It was his golden ticket. It wasn't just a piece of land, it was the key to keeping Diana and her cronies at bay. Armed with that knowledge, Jake walked back home, the weight of the papers in his hand. He knew the battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. But now, he had the upper hand. Diana wouldn't be able to bully him anymore. He was going to make sure of that. Later that evening, Jake decided to take a walk down to the dock. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the water. He stood there for a while, listening to the soft lapping of the waves against the posts, feeling a calmness he hadn't felt in days. It was his, and no one was going to take it away from him. The next day, Jake received a call from the HOA office. It was Diana. We need to talk about the lake, she said, her tone cold. Jake didn't hesitate. You're right, he replied, his voice calm but firm. We do need to talk. Jake was ready. The next morning, as the sun broke through the trees, he walked out to meet Diana. She had scheduled a meeting at the community center, her usual battleground, where she believed her authority was absolute. Jake arrived early, taking his time to walk around the property, the crisp morning air filling his lungs as he thought about everything he'd fought for. The lake, the docks, the land, his home. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. Today wasn't going to be like the others. He wasn't going to back down. Inside the meeting room, Diana was already waiting, sitting behind a polished desk, her face the picture of controlled authority. She looked up, giving him a tight smile. Glad you could join me, Jake, she said, her voice smooth, almost too sweet. Let's get this over with, shall we? Jake didn't sit down. He remained standing, his posture firm. "I'm not here to make deals," he replied, his voice steady. Diana raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "Well, then what are you here for?" she asked, a hint of annoyance creeping into her tone. Jake took a deep breath and set the papers he'd gathered from the county clerk's office on the table. He slid them across to her without a word. Diana eyed the documents suspiciously before picking them up. As she scanned through them, her face shifted from confident to confused, and then to a look of disbelief. "What is this?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Jake crossed his arms and leaned in. "It's a legal document. It shows that I control the docks, Diana. Not the HOA." Her face flushed as she put the papers down, clearly trying to maintain her composure. "This doesn't mean anything," she said, her voice growing defensive. "The HOA manages the community. You can't just claim ownership like this." Jake shook his head. "I don't need to claim anything. The records are clear. The docks are mine. You don't control them, and you never will." For a moment, there was silence between them. Diana's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee mug, but she didn't take a sip. She was fighting to keep control of the situation, but Jake could see the cracks forming in her carefully crafted facade. "You can't just walk in here and think you can take everything from us," Diana said, her voice rising slightly. "This is about more than just a lake. This is about the community." Jake finally took a seat, still calm but now with a hint of authority in his voice. "No, Diana. This is about power. You've been pushing people around for far too long. And it stops now." Diana's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that," she muttered, but Jake could see the fear creeping into her eyes. She knew she was losing. Jake stood up and walked toward the door. "You've been warned. I won't back down. This is my land, and now, you know. Who controls it?" As he walked out, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't over, but it was a start. And he wasn't going to let Diana or the HOA take away his home. Not without a fight. Jake had expected some pushback after his confrontation with Diana, but he hadn't anticipated how far she would go. The next morning, a notice from the HOA arrived in his mailbox, stamped with the official seal, the words "Violation Notice" in bold red letters. He ripped open the envelope, already preparing himself for the fight. As he scanned the paper, his eyes narrowed. Diana wasn't just playing defense. She was throwing everything she had at him, filing a formal complaint about his unauthorized use of property. The notice claimed he was obstructing HOA access to the lake, accusing him of illegally blocking the community's dock access, a direct attack on his rights. He couldn't help but smirk. She was grasping at straws, trying to hit him with everything in the book, hoping to scare him into submission. But it wasn't going to work. Jake wasn't some pushover. He knew what he had, and now he was ready to make his next move. He sat down at his kitchen table, staring at the letter. His mind was racing. What could Diana possibly do next? She didn't have the legal grounds to take him to court, and he knew it. The deed was in his name, and the docks were his. It was all there in black and white. But this wasn't just about property anymore. Diana had made it personal. She had underestimated him, and now she was going to regret it. After a few moments of quiet contemplation, Jake picked up the phone and dialed the number of his attorney, someone who had helped him with his business dealings for years. "I need your help," he said, his voice steady. "The HOA is coming after me. I've got a violation notice, but I've got something they don't know about. I need you to help me take action." His lawyer, Tom, was quick to respond. "I'll look over the documents. We'll get back at them. They've crossed the line." Jake hung up the phone, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He had the legal expertise on his side, but now he needed to make sure he had every piece of evidence he could get. He spent the next few hours gathering the necessary documents, checking every detail on the property records, and preparing a counterattack. Diana wasn't going to win this. Jake had everything he needed to take her down, and he wasn't about to let her continue her reign of terror. When the time came, he would make sure she knew who was really in control. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore, he was fighting for his home, his future, and for the principle that no one should be able to push him around. That evening, he sent a message to Diana, a calm but firm response letting her know that he would not back down. "I'm not going to let you intimidate me into giving up what's rightfully mine. Let's settle this the right way." He hit send, his fingers lingering on the keys for just a moment longer. This was just the beginning. Jake wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Jake knew he had to act fast. The violation notice from the HOA had arrived, but it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war, and he wasn't going to back down. He'd already set his plan in motion with his lawyer, Tom, but now it was time to take the next step. The next day, Jake arrived at the community center for the HOA's scheduled meeting, the same place where he'd confronted Diana before. This time, he wasn't just showing up to sit at the table. He was going to take control of the situation. As he walked into the room, he saw Diana already seated at the head of the table, a smirk on her face. The usual smug expression she wore whenever she thought she had the upper hand was now in full display. But Jake wasn't intimidated. "I trust you've had time to go over the paperwork," Jake said, his voice steady as he took a seat. Diana didn't respond at first, just kept her gaze fixed on him. She was trying to figure out what his next move was. Jake wasn't going to make it easy for her. "You've made a mistake, Diana," Jake continued. "I don't know what you were thinking when you filed that violation, but you're not getting away with it. The property is mine, and I have every right to do what I please with it." Diana's face tightened, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't say anything right away. Instead, she grabbed a stack of papers from her desk and slid them over to him. "I don't know what you're talking about, Jake," she said, her voice icy. "These papers are clear. You're obstructing HOA access to the lake, and that's a violation. You're going to have to pay up." Jake felt a surge of confidence. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. "You're wrong," Jake replied, reaching for the documents he'd prepared. "You've been playing with the wrong person, Diana. These documents show that I control the docks. That means you have no say in what happens with the lake. You're not in charge here, and you're not going to bully me into giving up my rights." Diana's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. "You can't just ignore the rules," she said, trying to hold on to her position. But Jake could see the cracks in her facade. He wasn't the one who had to back down. He had the law on his side, and she was starting to realize it. He laid the documents out on the table in front of her. "These aren't just papers, Diana. These are my rights. I'm not going to let you or anyone else take them away from me. You've crossed a line, and I won't back down." The room fell silent for a moment. Diana's eyes flicked back and forth between Jake and the papers, her mind racing. She knew he wasn't bluffing. He had her cornered. She had underestimated him, and now she was starting to see just how wrong she was. Diana opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Jake stood too, looking her straight in the eye. "No, Diana," he said calmly. "This is just the beginning. You've been warned." Jake sat at his kitchen table, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't felt in days. The confrontation with Diana had been tense, but now, he was starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Diana had walked out of the meeting, clearly rattled, and Jake knew she'd be back. She wouldn't give up that easily. But this time, things were different. He had the evidence, the law on his side, and a clear path forward. It was a matter of time before the HOA would realize they couldn't bully him into submission. Jake took a sip of coffee, his mind racing with possibilities. He'd been through tough situations before, but this felt different. This was personal. The property wasn't just land to him, it was a piece of his family's history, a legacy left by his grandfather. He wasn't about to let some HOA president tear it all down for the sake of control. The following day, Jake decided to take another step toward securing his rights. He reached out to the local sheriff's office to make sure he was fully backed by the authorities. If Diana tried anything else, Jake wanted to be ready. The sheriff's deputy on the phone assured him that his claims were valid and that he should feel confident moving forward. "If you need any help, we're here," the deputy said. "Just let us know if things escalate." Jake thanked him and hung up the phone, feeling even more reassured. He wasn't alone in this fight. As the week went on, Jake kept an eye on the lake, watching for any sign of the HOA trying to make another move. There was no way they could legally take what was his, but Jake wasn't going to wait around for them to try. He kept his lawyer in the loop, sharing every new development, and planned his next move carefully. He wasn't just playing defense anymore, he was about to turn the tables. A few days later, he got the call he'd been waiting for. It was Tom, his lawyer. "Jake, it's time," Tom said, his voice steady and confident. "We've got the paperwork ready to make sure they can't pull anything like this again. We'll file an official complaint and get this on the record." Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed. He wasn't going to wait for the HOA to strike first. He was taking control. He gathered the documents, signed them, and sent them over to Tom. It felt like a victory in itself. Jake stood up from his desk, walking toward the window that overlooked the lake. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the water. He could see the boats docked by the shore, his docks, the ones Diana had tried to take. He smiled, knowing the battle wasn't over, but the tide was turning in his favor. The HOA had underestimated him, but now they were going to have to face the consequences of their actions. Jake wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Jake stood by the window, staring out at the lake. The peacefulness of the water was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. His lawyer had filed the official complaint, and now it was only a matter of time before the HOA would have to face the consequences of their actions. He knew Diana wouldn't take it well, she never did, but Jake had no intention of letting her or anyone else push him around again. As the days passed, the tension grew. Jake received more threatening letters from the HOA, each one more desperate than the last, but it only solidified his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for his property, he was fighting for his peace of mind. The last thing he wanted was to be caught up in an ongoing battle, but he also knew he couldn't back down now. Diana's latest letter was full of threats, demanding that Jake remove his property from the HOA's jurisdiction and threatening legal action if he didn't comply. It was the same empty rhetoric she had used before, and Jake wasn't afraid. He simply filed the letter away and continued with his preparations. Then, one evening, he received an unexpected visitor. It was a neighbor, someone he had only spoken to briefly when he first moved in. The man, looking uneasy, knocked on Jake's door. "Hey, Jake," he said, his voice low. "I just wanted to give you a heads up. The HOA's been talking about you a lot lately. They've got the lawyers on speed dial, and I think they're really going to push this." Jake nodded, already aware of what was coming. "Thanks for the warning," he said. "But I've got it covered." The neighbor hesitated before continuing. "Well, I just thought you should know. Some of the others in the neighborhood, they don't like the way things are going with you and Diana. There's talk about siding with the HOA, and I wanted to make sure you were ready for it." Jake took a deep breath. He had expected this. The HOA had their influence, but he wasn't going to let them sway anyone. "I'll be fine," Jake said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's had enough of her overreaching control." The neighbor nodded, still looking uncertain. "Just be careful. It might get ugly." Jake watched as the man walked away, the weight of the situation settling in. But he wasn't about to let Diana or anyone else turn this into a fight that wasn't his to win. He had the law on his side, and he wasn't about to back down now. The next day, Jake met with his lawyer again to go over the final steps. He was ready for whatever the HOA would throw at him, and he knew this would end with the justice he deserved. The battle wasn't over, but Jake was now in control. As he walked back to his home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lake. The light reflected off the water, shimmering like a promise. Jake knew this fight was far from finished, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. He had the law, his neighbors, and his own resolve on his side. And that was enough. Jake sat down at his desk, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on him. The HOA had escalated their tactics, sending more legal threats and trying to paint him as the villain in a community that had once been peaceful. But Jake wasn't going to let them win. He had the support of his lawyer, Tom, and more importantly, he had the law on his side. The battle was far from over, but Jake was ready for whatever came next. He spent the morning reviewing the property records again, double-checking every detail to ensure he hadn't missed anything. His lawyer had advised him to stay calm and collected, but Jake knew that the HOA wasn't going to give up easily. Diana would keep pushing, trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. She always did. But this time, it was different. Jake wasn't going to be intimidated or pushed around. He had the power of legal precedent, the land beneath his feet, and the knowledge that he wasn't alone. He'd seen his neighbors start to come around, some even offering quiet support, realizing that the fight wasn't just Jake's, it was theirs too. They'd all been living under Diana's thumb for far too long. The moment of reckoning was coming, and Jake could feel it in the air. He sent a quick message to Tom, asking if there had been any new developments. Tom's reply came a few hours later, "We're set for the next round. The HOA's move is coming, but we're ready." That was all Jake needed to hear. He wasn't just going to wait around for Diana to make her next play. He was going to make the first move. The next morning, Jake called the local newspaper, arranging a meeting with the editor. He wasn't sure how far this would go, but he knew one thing: the public needed to know what was happening. If Diana thought she could bully him into submission, she needed to realize that this fight wasn't just about land, it was about fairness. It was about standing up to people like her who thought they could control others. Jake wasn't going to let her get away with it. The following day, the article went live, detailing the ongoing dispute between Jake and the HOA. It wasn't an attack on Diana, but it painted a clear picture of the abuse of power and the lengths the HOA had gone to in order to intimidate Jake. It wasn't long before people in the community started talking. Calls and messages flooded Jake's phone. Some were from neighbors who had been silent, unsure of where they stood, but now they saw things differently. They were standing behind him. Diana's grip on the community was loosening. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Jake leaned back in his chair, staring at the glowing screen. This wasn't over, but with the support of his neighbors and the law on his side, he knew it wouldn't be long before he got what he deserved: peace. He wasn't going to back down, and neither were the people who had stood by him. The HOA had underestimated him, and now they were going to learn the hard way. Jake was in control, and it was only a matter of time before he won. Jake knew the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. The HOA was on the defensive now, but Diana wasn't one to give up without a fight. The articles about the dispute had spread through the community, and people were starting to pay attention. Jake's phone buzzed non-stop with messages of support. His neighbors, many of whom had been silent for years, were now speaking up. It felt like a victory just to see people who had once been afraid to challenge Diana finally taking a stand. But Jake couldn't afford to get complacent. He knew that Diana wouldn't go down without a last-ditch effort. A few days after the article was published, Jake received a call from Tom, his lawyer. "We need to move fast," Tom said, his voice urgent. "The HOA is preparing to take legal action. They're trying to pressure you into settling." Jake's stomach tightened. He'd expected this. The HOA had to know they were losing control, and now they were trying to intimidate him into backing down. "What's the plan?" Jake asked. "I've got everything in order," Tom replied. "We'll fight this in court, but we need to be ready. I'm filing for an injunction to protect your property rights. Once it's in place, they can't do anything until the case is settled." Jake nodded. "Do it. I'm not backing down." Over the next few days, Jake's resolve was tested. The HOA sent more legal notices, each one trying to find a way to twist the law in their favor. But Jake wasn't intimidated. He had the upper hand now, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The court date was set for the following week, and Jake spent every waking moment preparing. He studied the legal documents, reviewing every detail with Tom, making sure they were ready for anything Diana's lawyers would throw at them. On the morning of the trial, Jake felt a calm determination that surprised him. He had spent weeks preparing for this, and he knew he had the law on his side. When he arrived at the courthouse, he was met by a small group of neighbors who had come to show their support. Some of them had lived in the community for years, others had just recently moved in, but they all shared one thing in common: they were tired of living under the thumb of the HOA. Jake smiled at them, grateful for their support. "Thanks for coming," he said. "This isn't just about me. This is about all of us." The trial began with the usual formalities, but it didn't take long for things to get heated. Diana's lawyer was aggressive, throwing out accusations and trying to discredit Jake's claims. But Jake and Tom were ready. They presented the deed, the records, and the undeniable proof that Jake had the legal right to his property. As the day went on, Jake could see the tide turning in his favor. Diana's team was losing ground, and the judge was growing increasingly skeptical of their arguments. Finally, after what felt like hours of back and forth, the judge ruled in Jake's favor. The HOA's claims were dismissed, and Jake's property rights were upheld. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Jake's heart swelled with pride. He had done it. The fight wasn't over, but it was a decisive victory. Diana and the HOA had lost this round, and Jake knew they would think twice before trying to bully him again. As he left the courthouse, Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had stood up for what was right, and he had won. He wasn't just defending his land, he was defending his peace, his future, and his right to live free of the HOA's control. Jake stood on the steps of the courthouse, feeling the weight of the past few months lift off his shoulders. He had won, but it wasn't just about winning in court. It was about standing up for what was his and taking back control. The fight with the HOA had taken its toll, but now that it was over, Jake knew the hard part was behind him. Diana's face when the judge's ruling was announced was burned into his memory. She looked stunned, as if she couldn't fathom that someone had actually stood up to her. Her confident demeanor had crumbled in the face of the law. Jake's neighbors, who had come to support him, were all smiles as they surrounded him outside the courthouse. It wasn't just a victory for Jake, it was a victory for the entire community. People had been living in fear of the HOA for years, afraid of the fines, the rules, and the overbearing demands. But now, they saw that things could change. "You did it, Jake," one of the neighbors said, clapping him on the back. "We all did," Jake replied, smiling. "This was about more than just me. This was about all of us taking back control of our lives." As Jake walked back to his truck, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just the victory in court, it was the knowledge that he had done something that mattered. He had made a stand, not just for his property, but for the future of his community. When he got home, he sat on his porch, watching the sunset over the lake. It was a peaceful moment, one he hadn't had in months. The sound of the water lapping gently against the shore was a reminder of what he had fought for. The land was his, and it would stay that way. The following days brought a sense of calm to the neighborhood. The HOA, defeated in court, had no choice but to retreat. Diana, once the unquestioned leader of the community, had lost her grip on power. People who had been too afraid to speak out now started voicing their opinions. It was a quiet revolution, but it was happening. As the weeks went by, Jake's life began to return to normal. He worked on his property, fixing up the house, enjoying the peace that had eluded him for so long. His neighbors started organizing community meetings, planning events that didn't involve the HOA's iron grip. Jake had become a symbol of resistance, not just against the HOA, but against anyone who thought they could control others. He had shown them that one person, standing firm, could make a difference. The sun set that evening, just like it had every other night, but this time, Jake felt different. The future was his to shape, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. Jake walked out onto his porch, the cool evening air settling over the land. The lake was calm, reflecting the fading light of the setting sun, just like it had on so many nights before. But this time, everything felt different. The neighborhood was changing. People were speaking up, taking ownership of their homes and their rights. The fight against the HOA had awakened something in them. Jake had fought for his land, his home, and his peace, and in doing so, he had sparked a movement. Diana, once the untouchable president of the HOA, had disappeared from the scene. Her power, once so absolute, was now nothing more than a distant memory. The HOA, stripped of its authority, had been forced to back down. For the first time in years, the residents of the neighborhood felt like they had a voice. They were taking back control of their community, making decisions for themselves without fear of the HOA's oppressive rules. Jake had become something of a local hero, but he didn't want the title. He wasn't in this for fame or recognition. He was in it for the simple right to live freely, without someone else trying to dictate his every move. In the weeks that followed, more neighbors stopped by to thank him, to share their stories of frustration with the HOA, and to tell him they were inspired by what he had done. Jake smiled and listened, happy that others were finding the courage to stand up as well. But there was something more to it than just standing up against the HOA. It was about building a stronger, more connected community. One where people respected each other's rights and worked together to improve their shared environment. Jake started attending the neighborhood meetings, not as a leader, but as a participant, someone who wanted to see the changes continue. And they did. People began organizing events, cleaning up the parks, and making sure the community remained a place people were proud to call home. The HOA was a shadow of its former self, and its influence continued to fade with every passing day. Jake had helped to bring about that change, but now it was up to everyone to keep it going. As he stood there, looking out at the lake, Jake realized something. This wasn't just about the land. It was about the people who lived on it. And in the end, that was what mattered most. They had all fought together, in their own ways, to protect what was rightfully theirs. They had all shown that when a community stands united, no one, no matter how powerful, can take that away. Jake sat back in his chair, the evening sun casting a warm glow across the lake. The battle with the HOA had finally come to an end, but the ripples of what he had accomplished were still being felt. It wasn't just about the land or the lake anymore, it was about the community that had come together. The people who had once been silenced by fear were now finding their voices. Neighbors were meeting up regularly, talking, laughing, and working together to make the area a better place for everyone. The oppressive rule of the HOA had ended, but what Jake had sparked was something more lasting, a sense of empowerment among his neighbors. Jake had shown them that standing up for what was right was worth the fight. As he walked through the neighborhood, people stopped him to thank him, to share stories about how they were now living with a renewed sense of freedom. But Jake never sought recognition. His reward was in seeing the changes that were taking place in the community. People were helping each other, taking pride in their homes and their shared spaces. The roads, once just pathways through a neighborhood, were now symbols of unity. The parks, once neglected, were being maintained and enjoyed by families. Jake's own property had become a symbol of resistance, a place where he could look out over the land and remember the fight, but more importantly, where he could see the peaceful future that was now possible for everyone. His neighbors, once hesitant and divided, now had a shared purpose. They were stronger together, united by a common cause. There were no more HOA meetings held in secret or behind closed doors. The meetings now took place in the open, in the community center where everyone was welcome. People were making decisions together, and for the first time in a long time, the power was in their hands. Jake had no intention of ever letting the HOA, or anyone else, take that power away. As the days passed, Jake found himself feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He could finally relax and enjoy the simple pleasures of life, the sound of birds in the trees, the gentle breeze across the lake, the quiet evenings spent on his porch. The struggle had been long and exhausting, but in the end, it had been worth it. He had stood up for his rights, and in doing so, had helped others find their own. Looking out over the water, Jake smiled to himself. The land, the lake, the community, everything was his to protect. And he would protect it, not just for himself, but for everyone who now had a voice.